It's a great pleasure for me to be here. My name's David Shookman. I was a BBC correspondent and science editor for many, many years, and for 20 of them reported on climate, energy, environment and science. That took me to coal mines. I went underground and filmed open-cast mines as well, climbed 5-megawatt wind turbine in the Irish Sea for a story about offshore wind, and was really impressed to see a solar panel factory hard at work in the United States. So I feel I've seen this journey close up as the science has become stronger and also as the effects of climate change, long predicted, are really starting to kick in. And we'd heard from scientists at Imperial College this morning that they can attribute much of the extraordinary heat of London right now to human-induced global warming, the overloading of the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. I'm going to confess I've got a personal mission with this whole agenda because I'm a new grandfather, and my 6-month-old grandson is really suffering in the heat. He's not sleeping. His bedroom was 28 degrees a couple of nights ago. So his parents aren't sleeping, and they're trying to go to work, and so they're pretty broken. And so I really feel for them, and it's a kind of indicator of really just how this country, and so many others, just isn't ready for the effects of climate change that we're seeing kick in. I'm just going to do one little plug. I've just published a book called The Response, which explores how the effects of climate change, I argue, are much more severe than many people realize. For example, the heat, but also wildfires in London, the flooding. Right now, hospitals out of action, trains not working, schools are shut. And I just think that the measures that we can take to make ourselves safer in the short term are within our grasp, but also the big picture of actually trying to drive down the rise in carbon emissions to head off the worst of global warming is also now achievable with the extraordinary rise of renewables and particularly the fall in their cost. And I know we're going to hear a lot more about that. The program this afternoon involves 2 panels of really specialist, top acknowledged experts. One who'll be exploring kind of the next steps in renewables in the transition. The other will tackle the thorny issue of how to pay for it. So I'm looking forward to both of those. But first, I'm going to invite to the stage the Executive Director of Adani Green, Sagar Adani, for the inaugural address of this conference. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a warm, really warm afternoon indeed. Welcome to the inaugural Adani Green Electrification Dialogue. It's a privilege to host all of you here at the iconic London Science Museum in collaboration with the Energy Transition Committee. So thank you all for making the time, the precious time out of all of your lives to join us here. We really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because never before has the mandate of energy security been more critical. All over the world, but especially in Asia. The events of the past 3 months have left every nation thinking. Today, all countries, every single one of them, developed or developing, are being forced to come to terms with what it means to future-proof their economies from relentless geopolitical shocks. At the same time, for most of the developing world, where hundreds of millions of people are rising into the middle class, who are increasing their energy consumption for a better quality of life. Affordability of energy continues to remain a fundamental challenge. And of course, the geopolitical disruptions have made this necessity into a monumental battle for survival. Completely independent of the 2 factors above most countries in the world, have also not been able to completely remove their reliance from fossil fuels. And they've not been able to move to predominantly green sources of power. And that concern of climate change and energy sustainability have not been addressed in one global voice. So my friends, energy security, energy affordability, and energy sustainability. We believe this is the ultimate global trifecta. As we've all discussed, I'm sure, many times before, one of the small, and we were speaking about it with Lord Adair and the team today morning, one of the small answers to this challenge is the electrification of the global economy. I thank Lord Adair Turner for leading our upcoming panel on how to accelerate the global shift to electrification. And I look forward to the insights from Greg Jackson and Alice Williams. My friends, let us talk about the one country whose explosive growth in energy consumption is going to arguably be one of the most critical factors driving the global energy agenda going forward in the future. India. Nowhere in the world, nowhere else in the world is electrification going to be more critical and more challenging than in India. It's going to be helpful to understand India's electricity demand and supply in context of final consumption. In 2024, India consumed about 10,000 terawatt hours across all energy sources. That's coal, oil, gas, nuclear, renewables. China, with a similarly sized population, 1.4 billion people, consumed 32,800 terawatt hours of energy. That's more than 3 times the energy consumed, final energy consumed for the same number of people. And let's put the scale of India's challenge and opportunity, but most importantly, the growth into perspective. We're talking about adding nearly 2,000 gigawatts of new power generation projects to the Indian grid over the next 2 decades. We're talking about adding 200 gigawatts of new energy capacity to the India's grid every year per year for the next 20 years, just to get to where China is today. All this while ensuring that this incremental energy remains affordable, remains accessible, and remains increasingly clean. That, my friends, is both the scale of the opportunity, but also the challenge, the monumental challenge that India faces over the next couple of decades. And for us to address that challenge, the path forward is very, very clear, that we must electrify everything. We must build an energy backbone that is anchored in resources that are available within the country. And this is where we have no choice but to be pragmatic and to leverage every single energy source that is available to us as a country. And it's no different for any country in any part of the world. We must do renewables, we must do hydro, we must do efficient thermal, we must do nuclear. We must do every single thing that is available within the geographic boundaries of the country, because as much as growth and as much as cost is critical, energy security is probably more critical than every single other consideration that India faces. And that's because without firm, cheap base load power, the math of the economy and the sustainability of the country just does not work. It would be very incomplete not to recognize the role that the government and the country's leadership has done in enabling this journey. Over the past decade, India's leadership has played an exceptional role in cutting red tape, in getting rid of unnecessary and outdated policies, revitalizing public undertakings, and very strongly encouraging private investments. The countless micro and macro policy changes by the government have resulted in an environment where businesses now grow, flourish, and prosper. From accelerating infrastructure development to expanding renewable energy capacity, strengthening transmission networks, and enabling very long-term investments, there has been both clarity of intent and continuity of action from the leadership and the government in India, especially over the last more than 10 years. And this continuity has been the critical enabler of resilience in India. Coming to the role of the industry and specifically the Adani Group, we are India's largest private sector operator in every aspect of the electricity value chain. We operate thermal power assets. We are building one of the world's largest renewable energy portfolios. We're targeting 50 gigawatts by 2030 and a substantial recently announced nuclear portfolio of 10 gigawatts by 2035. We're investing in large-scale energy storage, including pumped hydro projects, energy storage batteries. We're expanding transmission networks to move large quantums of electricity from renewable resource-rich states in one part of the country to consumption centers in other parts of the country. And we're developing large green hydrogen ecosystems as well. We're doing it all at a scale and speed that rarely would have been seen in any other part of the world. Because we're very clear that for India, at the size and scale of the requirement, incremental change will not and cannot cut it. And to make this a reality, our chairman, Mr. Gautam Adani, has committed over $100 billion towards energy transition. That is one of the largest private sector commitments made by any company in any part of the world. This is not a set of isolated investments, but an integrated energy strategy end-to-end. And for us at Adani Green, this is not just a financial pledge. It is our marching order. The energy challenge and the opportunity in front of India, my friends, is a far greater pie that any business group can digest alone. It will require collective action across India and the developing world, India and the developing and developed worlds together. It will require continued policy innovation. It will require billions of dollars in financing to deliver these assets on the ground. And it will require us to deliver the trifecta that I spoke about: energy security, energy affordability, and energy sustainability. Hence, I'm very grateful to Nigel Topping for chairing the panel on how to fund the acceleration of electrification. And I'm intrigued as to the thoughts of the panelists, Sean Kidney and Rhian Marie Thomas. Finally, on behalf of Adani Green, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude, as always, to Sir Ian Blatchford for our partnership with the Science Museum. You guys have been amazing. And to all of you, the leaders in energy, policy, and finance communities, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for sparing your valuable time to join our conversations. Let's have the dialogues begin. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. And let's move straight on to our first panel. Lord Adair Turner, co-chair of the Energy Transitions Commission. Please come to the stage with your panelists, please. And over to you. I don't know if there's a drum roll. We can give them on their way up. There we go. There we go. Brilliant. And, we need Greg. Good. Come on.
Sorry, I was doing my last-minute fact-checking.
Good. Okay. We're going to go to the first panel. I think we're
10 minutes behind the specific schedule, so I'm going to assume, unless somebody tells me that I'm managing this to 10 minutes later, I'm aiming to end this panel at 15:55. I believe in time management. It's just one of the things that I was taught as a kid, so I will stick to it. We've got a great panel, and I'll introduce them in a minute. I just want to say a few words up front about, well, first of all, I want to say, great pleasure to be organizing this panel jointly with Adani Renewables and the Science Museum. Adani Green, Adani Renewables have recently become members of the Energy Transition Commission, and we are looking forward to working very closely with them and other members of the Adani Group, which covers lots of incredibly important industries, including, for instance, cement, to try and work out all the ways that we can get to a net zero economy. The most important bit of getting to a net zero economy, not the only thing, but the most important bit, is clean electrification. And before turning to the panel, I just want to make a couple of comments about why clean electrification is the single most important thing. And it's important because it is, by combination, the route to decarbonization, energy efficiency, and lower cost. It's the bit of the energy transition which is capable of being a win-win-win. It's a route to decarbonization because we now know how to produce electricity with no CO2 emissions, and those ways of producing electricity with no CO2 emissions are getting cheaper and cheaper. The cost of solar PV has come down 95% in the last 15 years. The cost of batteries has come down 95% in the last 15 years. And so you can put solar and batteries together now, and you can deliver continuous electricity at a lower cost in many parts of the world than fossil fuels. So we have the ability to decarbonize electricity at a low cost in a way that we didn't 20, 30 years ago. And with that green electricity, we should electrify as much of the economy as possible. Mr. Sagar Adani, who just spoke, said we should electrify everything. I think everything we possibly can. I think there's a few I'm not sure we know how to electrify, but I think in the long term, we will electrify far more of the economy than we now think. As we electrify, we get a whole load of benefits. Electricity is the wonder technology. It is silent. It produces no pollution at the point of use, unlike our other energy sources. If out there every single vehicle on the road were electric, you would actually get an appreciable reduction on the temperature of the street, because every one of those non-electric vehicles out there is turning 75% of all its energy, not into kinetic energy in the wheels, but into heat. So in terms of local pollution effects, it's hugely beneficial. It is also, however, hugely energy efficient. At the moment, in a fossil fuel-dominated system, we use about 170,000 terawatt hours of what we call primary energy: oil, coal, gas. But we turn that into 125,000 terawatt hours of what we call final energy: electricity, diesel, petrol, because a third of the energy in that coal, oil, and gas disappears in heat losses at power stations and in refineries before we get to the point where we use it. But we actually only get about 60,000 terawatt hours of useful energy, because you have no use for a litre of diesel. You can't consume it. You can't get enjoyment out of it. What you want is kinetic energy in the wheels of your car. But by the time it gets to the kinetic energy in the wheels of the car, 75% has disappeared in heat. So useful energy, which is what we want in the current system, is only about a third of primary energy. By electrification, we fundamentally change that. EVs turn 90% of the energy in the battery into kinetic energy in the wheels. Internal combustion engines only turn 25%. They're fundamentally more efficient. The most efficient gas boiler will only put 0.9 of a kilowatt hour of heat into your home for every kilowatt hour of chemical energy in the gas. It won't go above 90% efficiency, but a heat pump, by sucking heat out of the external atmosphere, can put 4 kilowatt hours of heat within your home for every kilowatt hour of electricity that you input. And that means that we can have lower cost of operation of EVs, of heat pumps versus gas boilers, and a cost benefit to the consumer. But increasingly, it's a cost benefit even in upfront equipment. Across the world now, we're going to the point where EVs are cheaper to buy up front than internal combustion engines. And that's inevitable because they're much simpler things to make. They have far less moving parts. And indeed, in general, everything to do with electrification and the production of electricity, everything to do with the manipulation of photons, ions, electrons, is falling faster than everything to do with the manipulation of molecules, with physics, as it were, is driving costs faster than chemicals, and that is going to go on and on and on. So clean electrification is the core of what we want to do. There is a hierarchy of what we should be electrifying. We should be electrifying vehicles, passenger road transport, freight road transport, residential heat, commercial heat, low temperature industrial heat, but also increasingly, and I know Arun is going to talk about this, we can increasingly expand it into high temperature industrial heat as well. And so maybe we will get pretty close to what Sagar said earlier, electrify everything. I will stick to electrify everything you possibly can, but at the ETC, we think electricity is going to go from 30,000 terawatt hours globally today to something like 100,000 by the end of the century. We are entering a new period of industrial revolution, and it is based on electricity. So that's why we want to electrify, but I now want to introduce a panel who are going to talk about, well, how do we do it? What's stopping us doing it faster? What are the specific challenges en route? And we have three great panelists: Greg Jackson, founder and CEO of Octopus Energy. And I suspect there isn't a person in the room who doesn't know about Octopus Energy. And if you don't know about it, you will by the time Greg has spoken about it. Alice Williams from Schneider Electric Digital Energy. Schneider Electric, oh, by the way, we have three members of the ETC here: Octopus, Schneider Electric, and Adani Green. Schneider Electric, a leader in all the technologies to do with the management of buildings, the management of industrial processes, the management of electricity in particular in an efficient fashion. And finally, Arun Sharma, who is the advisor to the chairman of Adani Group, Group Head of Sustainability and Climate Change. So, with that, I'm going to turn over to you, Greg, to start us off on, from your perspective, what's getting in the way of us driving electrification as fast as we want to drive it, and how ambitious should we be?
First of all, thank you so much for that overview. It's really hard speaking after Adair because he literally knows everything and then summarizes it unbelievably compellingly. But so I'm going to start with a story, actually. My first job, I left school at 16 to write video games. I was a really good technologist. At some point, I ended up going to university and then working for a large company called Procter & Gamble. When I was at Procter & Gamble in the mid-1990s, my boss came to me one day and said, "You know about technology. Do you fancy running our website?" And now, I'd used the internet when I was at university in 1992, and I can tell you, it didn't look like the future. I said, "It's rubbish." I said, "It takes ages for a page. This is not going to work." Right? So I turned down the chance to run the website because I knew too much about technology. What I didn't know about was exponential growth. And if you ever want to know why there are a bunch of companies that created the greatest value in the world ever around the time of the internet boom, it's because there were some entrepreneurs that understood exponential growth, and they saw the capabilities of computing, communication, and usage numbers, and they just extrapolated the exponential growth, and they got in while everybody else rejected it. That lesson has stuck with me forever, and when I look at the technologies of electrification, they follow the same curve. Adair mentioned the plummeting costs in batteries, solar. By the way, similar shape curve, different numbers, but for wind. But for electric vehicles, for electrification of heat, they all follow these curves. And when you bring these curves together, i.e. the ability to generate electricity ever cheaper, exponentially cheaper, and the ability to use it with equipment that's following the same curves, and by the way, optimize it with computing that's following the same curves, the very mature world of fossil fuels can never catch up, right? The genie's out the bag. So the first thing I'd say is that in today's world, a fossil fuel economy and an electrified economy probably have roughly the same kind of outcomes. But give it 5 or 10 years, because the exponential growth is not stopping, right? That's the point, all right? So give it 5 or 10 years, countries that do not recognize the opportunity of electrification are going to increasingly look medieval. They'll still be burning stuff while others have got astonishing clean streets, clean industry, and lower cost of production and of living than ever. That's part number one. I started to tell a couple of stories because I learned a lot from that internet revolution. The other industry that I'd love to look at is music streaming. You will all remember when the only way you could stream music was illegally. Now, it was convenient, it was free, but that wasn't the reason most of us did it. We did it because it gave us access to an incredible range, very conveniently, on a whole slew of devices that were becoming available. And the music industry's reaction was not to recognize that their business was actually finding, signing, protecting the IP, and promoting artists. They thought their industry was selling bits of plastic that contained music. And so they literally helped lobby for laws that would send their customers to prison rather than working out how to adopt these new technologies for their industry. Eventually, the dam broke. Technology always wins in the end. And today, the music industry makes more money from streaming and from the services such as concerts. We've never had billion-dollar concerts before. You now have billion-dollar tours. All of that kind of innovation occurred after 15 years of resistance from the industry. So, Adair, you said, what is holding us back? The music industry is pathetically weak compared to the fossil fuel industry. And I'm not being a conspiracy theorist about it. The fossil fuel industry, they literally have governments will send armies to defend their businesses. Anytime I go into a room with politicians, there'll be half a dozen people there from that industry. I'm not saying they're evil, and I'm not saying they're cynical. But like the music industry, currently they see their business as, for example, selling energy in a certain package, not as providing the means to, for example, get from one place to another or to heat or cool a building. As a result, they are so resistant to the change we need. And just like I didn't understand the internet because I saw it too soon, BP first started being beyond petroleum in the 1990s. The technology wasn't there. Anybody I speak to in that industry tells me why the technology of today won't work, because they've missed the impact of that exponential change. So both their self-interest and their lack of understanding mean that the most powerful lobbying force in the world is holding us back. But if you want to see the real opportunities, honestly, look, I'm not naive about it, but you see it in China in particular. I was there a couple of weeks ago. Every single two-wheeled vehicle is electric. They're silent. There's no pollution. Every taxi, every bus, in most cities, probably half the cars on the road, in some 70%. Vans, even trucks. I was with the biggest maker of batteries in the world, and I said to him, in the UK and Europe, only 1 or 2% of the trucks being sold are electric. In China, it's 25%. He said, no, Greg, that was last year. Now it's 37%. So they're not looking at a whole load of curves that say, here are the sacrifices we have to make to go clean. They are beginning to build an electrical economy and powering increasingly from renewables. So we all know about Chinese coal, but now 70-odd% of all renewables being built in the world are being built in China. Right? And they're not just doing it because they're nice people, they may or may not be. They're doing it because it gives them energy security, energy independence, and of course, by the way, tackles climate change. And so I think my closing thought on what's holding us back is every time Adair or I talk about the way in which electrification can slash costs for industries and for consumers, there's a whole load of people who sell energy or who are the politicians representing towns that currently provide energy who see falling costs as a huge threat. And we're not looking enough at the consumer and the businesser that will benefit enormously from falling costs of energy. But unless we learn to look at the demand side rather than the supply side, we risk missing the boat. So I would say to us, let's not, look, we will continue to need fossil fuels for a while, but we need to be really clear. Fossil fuels are the tobacco industry. In decline, it still generates great returns, but we've moved on. And we now, in the advanced economies of the West, need to do the same.
Great, Greg. Thanks very much. Greg, listening to you talking about failure to understand exponential curves, I failed to understand them, and my fellow committee members failed to understand them when we produced our first report at the Climate Change Committee in 2008, because I was the first chair of the UK Climate Change Committee, and we tried to think about what was going to happen to the costs of different technologies, and we were very proud of our careful analysis, and so we tried to think what might happen to the cost of carbon capture and storage between, say, 2010 and 2025, and solar PV between 2010 and 2025. And after a great deal of deliberation, we thought that we knew solar PV would come down at quite a pace. We were very, very optimistic about it, and we put in a figure that it might come down by about 40%. And it came down 95%. We were so wrong that I rather hope people have destroyed all copies of our reports, because it just showed we did not understand exponential curves. If anybody has not looked at the figures, it's an interesting question I sometimes try. How much do you think the cost of solar PV has come down in the last 50 years? Many people will say 90%. Many will say 99%. Most people don't know that the correct answer is 99.9%. That the cost of solar panels per watt of power has come down 1,000 times in 50 years and will keep coming down for some reasons which we can't go into, but they are inherent to the nature of this technology. Meanwhile, we looked at CCS and we thought that that might come down by 25 or 30%, and it failed to come down at all. Basically, we have a set of technologies which are capable of being mass manufactured and standardized, which achieve cost reductions which are not achieved by things which are bespoke engineering and the manipulation of molecules. So, turn to you, Alice. You're leading Schneider Electric's digital energy business here in UK and Ireland, and you're actually working with customers, their buildings, working out what are decarbonisation options. I mean, how optimistic are you at the pace at which we're moving, and what do we need to do to go faster?
Thank you. So the first thing I'd say is I'm an optimist and a bit mischievous with my view on things at the minute, because I think we have a moment in time, particularly in terms of how the demand market is working, where, if we're very honest, this room is the choir, right? So we all believe in decarbonisation and sustainability, and that's why we show up to events like this, and it's why we do London Climate Action Week. But the reality is, not everybody is the choir, and capital talks, and the economy talks, and profits talk. And so for a long while, where we would see a little bit of that friction, a little bit of that slowdown, was, are people willing to spend the capital to do it just because it's clean? Now, the really fun thing about this moment in time is this has become a question of affordability and, frankly, accessibility to power. And I'm speaking particularly from commercial building side of things. Greg's organization really helps support residential. I'm on the commercial building side of things, but that is commercial real estate, that is hospitals, that is education centers, that is data centers. And at this inflection point in time when we're talking about energy security and energy resilience, we also need to power data centers that are going to consume double the terawatts by 2030 that they currently do. And so we start to see energy and ultimately access to efficient, which electricity is, and agile, which electricity is, being a real mandate just to continue doing your business. So if we're going to build data centers, how am I going to maintain access to the power I need to power my hospital or my university or my building or actually my manufacturing plants, etc. in the UK? So as we see it accelerate in the real world, really one of the questions we have is, how do we do that in existing buildings as well? So we can quite often imagine these, certified, green, 100% electrified buildings of the future. But the reality is, and you look out the window and it's wonderful, what a wonderful view, by the way, most of our building stock is already here. Most of it already has maintenance backlogs. Most of it already has operations that need to continue running. And therefore, how do our industrial sites, you don't want to take your industrial site offline because you immediately lose profits the moment you do that. And so how do we electrify broadly a building stock that is already here, and how do we make that palatable? So that's the kind of challenge, and I guess the moment we're seeing at the minute. I am optimistic because the conversation has really started to move to performance, and our customers are realizing that this does not have to be the overnight transformation. So 100% electrification and full upscale of your manufacturing facility in Scarborough, for example, which we just did our own, so we've lived through the pain. That is a really big thing to wrap your head around when you're trying to do it all at once and when you're thinking about how do I run my P&L and how do I roll out my capital. But actually, Greg talked about, obviously, exponential gains. I think the compound effect within that is really, really important for businesses regards to electrification as well. So what we're starting to see is the appetite that says, hey, I can take one first step. And that might, for example, in an office building in London, look like occupancy sensors. Super simple technology, right? But the cheapest watt of electricity is still the one you don't waste, or any energy, to be fair, is still the one you don't waste. So occupancy sensors, which in London we can demonstrate can leave you at a lower energy setting for 76% of your business operating time. You can reduce your bills by 22% just from the rollout of occupancy sensors, and the same in terms of your carbon emissions as well. And the payback period, even for very sophisticated versions of that, can be over 2 years. And so what I'm excited about, I guess, and we see in the market with our customers, is they're starting to understand that it's the same as a fitness journey, right? I do not have to go out and run the London Marathon, certainly not in this heat. I do not have to do that tomorrow. Tomorrow I have to get up, put my trainers on, tie them up and leave the door, and that's my first step that I can take. Similarly, we are starting to see this in industry. So we're starting to see people electrify industrial operations. Again, Schneider, and hopefully you'll see that we got our accolade for #1 world's most sustainable company again, third year in a row. Just yesterday it was announced, but we're trying to walk our own talk. So we have our own manufacturing sites where we're going for electrification across our operations. Now, I know we're going to cover later, we don't have some of those high energy intensity, hard to abate sectors. But increasingly we're seeing customers see that as a pathway to competitiveness. Because again, what they know is that they get secure energy if they electrify. They get power quality, which they electrify, and that's really important, particularly in complex operations, where if you don't have the right power quality and you're modulated, and actually electricity is much better in terms of power quality, then all your harmonics are off, and you can just be shedding profit throughout your infrastructure without even realizing it. And so we're seeing quite simple steps that people are then getting the compound effect of. They're getting the savings for which they can share back to their boards, they can share back to their investors, and they can reinvest either in future projects, depending on their overall strategy and particularly what they're communicating, or they can give back to shareholders, which again is that really economic cycle of why would we bother investing in this. So I am very optimistic. I think the interesting thing for us to think about here is that ultimately this is about asset readiness. So again, we have huge potential in terms of clean, green energy coming onto the grid. The grid must be ready, and that is a whole nother ball game. But also individual assets must be ready, and a lot of that is about visibility, is about actually knowing what you have. If you ask a number of portfolio managers, they may be like, I got 4 buildings somewhere in the city, maybe. But it's actually about having visibility so you can take control of where your energy is, where you can save money, and you can actually optimize then the electricity that you do bring on board. So I'm a general optimist. As I say, I also recognize the game we're currently playing in, and if people aren't interested in investing in clean, they are interested in investing in saving money normally.
Great. Alice, thank you for focusing on some of the real-world challenges when you're dealing with commercial buildings or industrial facilities, the assets that exist at the moment. And I think at the ETC, we're very aware of a sort of spectrum of difficulty on this electrification journey. And the easiest bit really is the passenger car. I mean, every now and then, somebody buys a new car. Consumers are quite capable of working out what car they want, and they get rid of an old asset and they get a new asset, and that asset is increasingly definitively cheaper to buy and to run, and it's a better product. And we are very, very optimistic about how rapidly the electrification of passenger cars, but also increasingly freight, is going to go. But the moment you go to commercial buildings or to some of residential buildings with heat pumps, to industrial facilities, you've got a much more complicated thing, because you've got an existing asset. You're not just getting rid of one asset and buying another. It's not a nice, easy binary decision. You're struggling with lots of intermediate possibilities. And I think as we think forward, and there's going to be this target at COP31 about driving electrification across the world, helping countries think through the spectrum of difficulty and the different policies that are required for different sectors to drive electrification will be important. And that brings me to you, Arun, because Adani Group is driving the development of renewables, as we've heard earlier, but you are also, is it the biggest or the second biggest cement producer in India? In India through your purchase of Holcim. And I think you are at the cutting edge of some of the ideas about how we might extend electricity even to what we have previously thought of as very hard to electrify sectors of the economy.
Well, thank you, Adair. I think we had a commissioners' meeting of the Energy Transition Commission yesterday. And the discussion was about what can we do to keep closer to the Paris targets. So the biggest chunk is electrification. The next chunk is decarbonize electrification. And of course, then a small chunk is get the fossil fuel to become more efficient and eventually phase out. But an equally big chunk is how to address hard to electrify sectors. So this is something, and the best way to explain how we are doing it is perhaps to take the example of our cement business. Our manufacturing capacity is 109 million tons a year. That is more than the entire annual output of United States. And it turns out when we inorganically grew our cement business, it had a science-based target initiative of 2050, net zero. And the real question was whether we should stick with this target or not. Because in India, carbon capture and storage is not a viable option because sequestration reserves have not been characterized. You will have to capture the carbon dioxide, put it in a ship after liquefying it, and rent expensive space from Saudi Arabia. The economics doesn't work. But we said, and this is where the promoters of the company, Sagar, Karan Adani, who was looking after cement, they felt that if Adani Group cannot stick to the 2050 net zero target, who can? So the first thing they did was exactly what Adair said, order a gigawatt of captive renewables. Wherever the low-hanging fruit is, you are able to electrify. Then we started looking at innovation. So there are two sources in cement. One is the kiln where you burn coal. And the other is the calcination process where you produce clinker from calcium carbonate. Now, in the kiln, we need coal because electricity is not able to get us to high heat. We scouted around the world, and our cement team was able to identify a Finnish company called Coolbrook that has figured out how to use inert gases like nitrogen and air and keep rotating it to sonic boom and capturing that energy to produce heat. At COP last year, we announced not a pilot, but a small amount of the heating in the kiln in a full cement plant, which gives return on investment in a few years. So it was not only a full-scale implementation in the plant, but it had a business model. If this is successful cost effectively, which we believe it will be, then we will start trying other parts of the kiln, and this is electricity to high heat. Then we started focusing on the kiln. The problem in the kiln is that when you go through the calcination process, you are again using fossil fuels. And then what you get is flue gas, which is both from the combustion of fossil fuel and also the process emissions from the calcium carbonate. And if you want to capture the carbon dioxide, good luck, you're looking at $100 plus per ton. So what we now did is we partnered with an Australian company with a UK presence, Lilac, who have developed the technology and have done pilots in Europe on preheaters for the calcination process. So this one, we are now implementing the design phase in an existing cement plant where the preheater had to be replaced anyway. So we are using the Lilac technology, which will allow us to use electricity. And it will increase in clinker production, so that makes the business case more viable. But the beauty is that not only it opens the door for electrification of the calcination process, but the carbon dioxide that you get is a pure stream carbon dioxide. There is no cost of carbon capture. And that carbon dioxide, combined with green hydrogen, will give you cost-effective e-methanol, which can be exported to countries like Germany that have to figure out a way to decarbonize the chemical industry. When you look at the chemical industry, almost every part of the process, intermediate step is methanol. Right now that is being done from naphtha or natural gas. If we can produce industrial CO2, you might wonder that the carbon dioxide is still coming from cement. But if you are making PVC or long-lived chemicals, you have effectively captured the carbon dioxide in there. So this is our pathway. Innovate with all these technologies. It is using green hydrogen and derivatives. And by the way, I believe that green molecules are electrification on steroids. You just need a lot more electricity upfront. And our plan is to try to have one net zero cement plant by 2035 and then replicate it in the next 15 years to meet that 2050 net zero target. So this is how we are trying to do that. But I have to acknowledge the promoters, their vision. Professional management will look at the next 3 or 4 years. They are here that this pledge will, they are young enough that by 2050, they will be there to answer for it. But this is a great opportunity where Adani Group is able to bring all the pieces together in the decarbonization journey.
Great.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's interesting to think about how much of all our emissions can we electrify away. Depending how you count methane on an equivalent basis, you can think about the world as producing about 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. Of those, at least 30 come from the things that I think at some stage we will definitely electrify, which is road transport, residential and commercial space heating, and low to medium temperature industrial heat, up to say 400 degrees centigrade. Beyond that 30, there's 10, which we call this hard to electrify sector. And what is interesting is how far into that will we actually take electrification of that 10? And that makes me feel that clean electrification is certainly 60, 70% of everything we need to do to get to a zero carbon economy. It isn't everything, there's stuff to do with the food sector, but it's a lot. Now, I'd like to ask one question to Alice and Greg in particular, and then I will see whether there's a chance for maybe one question from the floor. I know there are a lot of expert people I can see from here, and some of you may want to ask a question. The question I want to ask you, Greg and Alice, is about not electricity, but peak electricity, right? Because we know that when you use a gas boiler, right, the cost of using the gas boiler is the same at, 7 o'clock in the evening on a winter night and at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's the cost of the gas. But it is the inherent feature of electricity and of the systems that we're building that electricity costs different amounts at different times of day. That's because of the intermittency of generation and the problems of balancing supply and demand. It is also crucially, and we don't often spend enough time about it, on the distribution grid and the transmission grid. I had lunch on Tuesday with, many of you may have met him this week, Hakan Yilmaz, who runs a big part of Carrier air conditioning business, and he was telling me, I think it's something like 25% of the peak load electricity in the US is everybody hitting on their air conditioners at the same time. They now have a major product where they are selling together a air conditioner and a battery as a joint product in order to make sure that you can run the air conditioner when you want, but not necessarily take electricity off the grid when you want. Could you both comment on just how big are these challenges and what are the mechanisms by which we're going to make sure that we don't, what I would say, electrify in a dumb way? The dumb way to electrify is to boost electricity demand and then have to build our grids to meet huge peaks and various forms of backup generation to meet huge peaks, and maybe talk about it from the residential point of view and talk about it from the commercial point of view. Yeah, Greg, far away.
I think this is one of the most important aspects. At the moment, our electricity is too expensive in the UK, across Europe, and in by way of some other countries. It costs maybe 5 or 10p a unit to generate electricity in the UK from renewable sources, but by the time it comes out your socket, it's 25p. So it's gone up to 5x, and then a big chunk of your bill is fixed costs on top of that. Our system is brutally inefficient. We need to fix that to get electricity costs down and to enable consumers and businesses to benefit from the genuine low cost at which we can generate electricity most of the time. If I break that into maybe 3-ish thoughts. Adair, you first of all mentioned the kind of the fact that electricity is not the same price all the time, unlike gas. So at the moment in the UK, the price of electricity varies on a typical day, the wholesale price, from maybe 3 pence a kilowatt hour to 35 pence, depending on the time of day. It varies every half hour. Quite often it goes negative. You literally get paid to take it. And sometimes it spikes to extraordinary levels. For example, yesterday it hit 85p at one point, I think. So the first thing is if you can grab more of the electricity at the cheap times, then you can power life more cheaply. This used to be impossible. But with smart meters, with huge amounts of data processing, and with devices like electric vehicles and thermal control, you've got huge flexibility when you use electricity. An electric vehicle owner doesn't care whether you charge their car at 6 p.m., midnight, or 4 a.m., as long as they've got enough to get to work in the morning. Octopus intelligently charges in the UK about 400,000 cars. That is, you literally just pair the car software with our software, and we squirt the electricity at the cheapest times. That collectively is 3 gigawatts of charging. If you don't know what a gigawatt is, the UK is a 50 gigawatt system, so it's already fairly significant. In fact, it's the same as, 2 or 3 nuclear reactors in scale. But cars, currently only 5 or 6% of cars are electric, and they're not all with us, sadly. But if you multiply it up, that's 120 gigawatts of cars in a 50 gigawatt system. That's where we're going. Inevitably, it's where we're going to end up. Right now, the UK is planning on spending 100 or 200 billion pounds on new grids and networks, largely to be able to accommodate electrification, largely of transport. But when you use the system intelligently, like I've just described, a household with an electric vehicle has 60% higher consumption, but only 4% higher peak. And it's the peak that matters, because if you exceed the peak, the grid melts. The point really being, you can accommodate an awful lot of electric cars with very little new infrastructure if you manage them intelligently. That also means they're 6 times cheaper to run than a petrol car. Everyone wins. But right now, and I talked about incumbency earlier, the incumbents are not just the oil industry. The incumbent electricity industry is so conservative, so laggardly, and so fails to understand these changes. The planning framework for the UK is for every 100 percentage points to increase the amount of electricity consumption, they assume the peak will increase 70. That is so catastrophically wrong, and we're all going to pay for it. We could feel better. Europe's going to spend 1.2 trillion euros on new grid, and Germany's trying to build 20 gigawatts of gas plants to handle these issues. It is genuinely nuts and wasteful. Just a couple more facts then. I was with the CEO of one of the biggest car companies in Europe. He's struggling with the EV transition. He said he was sitting with the CEO of one of the biggest grids in Europe. And he said to the grid operator, like, how many EVs can you support on a street without new infrastructure? And the grid operator said, 3 or 4? I mean, first of all, I just pointed out that's bollocks. Worse than that, pretty soon, most electric vehicles will be able to do what we call vehicle to grid. That is, they go both ways. A car with vehicle to grid has a negative peak consumption, i.e. it supports the grid at peak times. I.e. the more vehicle to grid cars you put on any area part of the grid, the more of everything else you can have. It's not just EVs. A house with a heat pump only has 14% higher electricity consumption. 14% higher peak, because we can shift it. And aircon. Even in Texas, we have customers that pair their air conditioning with us, and we don't put batteries in them, although that's great. What we do is we know when the peak electricity time is going to be, so we pre-chill the home, so it's just below your target temperature, and during the periods of peak electricity pricing, we'll let the temperature drift up a little bit. You won't get uncomfortably hot, but in return you save a lot of money because the electricity you're not using is the most expensive. So every part of the system, it reduces the cost because you're competing less for electrons at the times of peak demand. It reduces the amount of grid you need, which should reduce European energy costs by, expenditure by €1 trillion over the next sort of decade or two. If we did it, which currently we're not planning to do. But I think also crucially, it reduces the problem of intermittency. People always say energy incumbent thinking is, it's not always windy, it's not always sunny. Of course that's genuinely a problem, but it ain't such a big problem if you turn that around and say when it is windy, when it is sunny, you've got astonishing amounts of zero marginal cost energy that we can use these days, reducing our demand at the rest of the time, so everything gets cheaper.
Great, very clear. And the scale of the potential benefit from what I call doing electrification cleverly, not dumbly, is really huge. Alice, from the commercial building point of view, and Schneider Electric thinks about this a lot, and you have a lot of products that help people do this. Can you comment briefly on this challenge?
Yeah, I guess if you take big and certainly leading edge commercial buildings and campuses, the reality is they are already part of this flexible future energy system, right? So they have not just switched fuels. What they have done is integrated on-site generation, storage, EV, and their own flexible controls. The reality is at the minute they're not then stacking into an intelligent grid, but ultimately what we see is the overall energy infrastructure becoming more flexible, becoming much more variable in terms of where the demand is being generated and the storage is as well, and the microgrid and prosumer approach coming into play, particularly with some of the big infrastructure pieces. And that is really, really critical in terms of having an intelligent energy layer, because otherwise, again, what you can't do is have equity across economies. So, okay, big players who can afford to will invest in that, and they will have energy sovereignty in their own operations. But then when you bring it down to a city level, for example, all that does is actually take quality power away from, say, a school or an NHS trust that also needs access to high quality power, also wants to digitize their operations, incorporate AI, and has more power hungry needs. And so this is a criticality of the grid ultimately having a data spine. We talk quite a lot with policymakers about the importance of seeing digital infrastructure as core infrastructure. It's no longer negotiable. We look at funding for what we consider to be traditional, shovels in the ground type infrastructure, but ultimately you're adding more dumb systems onto something that requires intelligent. We very excitingly, Kraken, Octopus's technology arm, we announced a partnership with Kraken, again, to bring our minds together. And that is really trying to focus on real-time grid visibility so that you can start to unlock demand across these flexible infrastructures at the macro layer as well. And that's very important. We're seeing it in some legislation now, the requirement to have digital. But we do also have a moment to do it where funding's been released. We're going to go through big phases of uplift in the grid. It will be cheaper for us to digitize it now than after the fact.
Aaron, do you want to comment on this issue of flexibility, or should we take a question from the floor? What do you want to?
The flexibility at a different level.
Okay.
And this is actually, Sagar was referring to the proactivity of the Indian government in a regulatory way. I think sometimes when I'm talking at New York Climate Week or others, and I tell them that when we were building the world's largest renewable energy park, the transmission line connecting to one single national grid in India was ready before even a single electron was fired. They are just blown away. So I think the point that I want to make is that India has a big challenge, but the government has really taken proactive steps to help the business model to emerge from the private sector. So they have plans. Whenever land is allocated for renewables, the bidding for transmission line also happens at the same time. Can it happen faster? Yes. Can the states do more? Yes. But what happened is that when the transmission line is there and it is only catering to solar and wind, then it is not being used during non-solar hours. So their innovation was, okay, you only as an independent power provider have it for solar hours, we'll make it available to someone else. So the incentive for players like Adani is execute 3.3 gigawatt hours of battery in 9 months so you can actually sell merchant electricity in the evening to all the manufacturers in India that eventually are trying to avoid paying CBAM to Europe. So what is happening is we have to figure out, it is sustainability winter, but we have to figure out international regulatory framework, Indian regulatory framework, the private sector identifying business models to do this. And I always like to say that China has shown the way. The fact that we are even in the game to get to well below 2 degrees is because China has shown the economy can be electrified. But Chinese industrial policy has played a very important role. But China had the public finances to put huge amounts of money in industrial policy. The Chinese industrial policy was on steroids, whereas the Indian industrial policy is on Ozempic, because it doesn't have the level of finances. And that has led to better utilization of resources. And like Ozempic, there are further benefits to following that approach. So I think that's the answer from an Indian perspective.
No, and I think from the ETC point of view, we have become great admirers of some of the innovations that have occurred in India. The ability, for instance, to use the transmission network as a common carrier system, to simply say, I'm going to do a huge bit of renewables at the other end of India and then take the electricity notionally out at a different area and simply pay a charge, very easy. And also the round-the-clock renewables. The round-the-clock renewables contract has been a real innovation, which we talk about for the rest of the world. Look, I'm sorry, I've failed to control time. I am going to stick to time. We've done about 48 minutes on this one, but I think we've had a very good discussion of an issue which we could talk about for much longer, but I think we've got some idea of some of the challenges, but the enormous opportunities in electrify, electrify, electrify. Thank you very much to the whole of the panel.
Thank you all very, very much indeed. And I've been asked to ask you just to hang on for the photographer who I just saw there, to get a shot of the panel, please, before they depart.
You want us sitting, or do you want us posed?
Okay, this is art. This is art. Yeah. And then we're going to have a little break just to get a cold drink, and then we're going to crack on with the second panel because we are running a little bit late. But it was worth it, I think, Adair. Lovely, happy. Many, many thanks indeed. Thank you. I think just take a 2-minute break. It was going to be 5, but stretch your legs, get a drink, and then come back very, very quickly, and we'll move on to the second panel. Thank you. Welcome back for part 2. Could I urge you all to take your seats, get a cold drink. Hope you're staying hydrated, not too hot, in this amazing room. I did one event earlier this week in a very fashionable loft in Smithfield Market with a glazed roof and no air conditioning. That's where we developed the air hug. We decided we couldn't actually make any contact. And look, after that amazing opening panel, let's move straight on. Nigel Topping, Chairman of the Climate Change Committee, a brilliant panel of experts. Nigel, over to you.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to Adani Renewables, thank you to ETC, and thank you to the Science Museum for hosting us. I will make sure we finish on time. I know it's the end of a long, hot week, but I want to make sure we really get our money's worth out of this great panel. I want to start by saying that I seem to be making a habit of following Adair around, not just following on one panel to the other, but of course, I've been involved in the ETC since the beginning, and it's been a fantastic source of very practical insights, both from the quality of the analysis and also the inputs from all of the member companies. But of course, I've also followed Adair as a chair of the Climate Change Committee, where he was the founding chair. And although I think I can say that I'm probably having to deal with slightly harder politics than he had to, I think it's also true that all the work that I and the committee and the team do very much follows from the very solid commitment to rigorous analytical research and transparency that Adair pioneered, and which really pioneered internationally. And I see just the last 2 days, I've been speaking to ministers from Indonesia and Korea who are keen to, in their own way, learn from and mimic the work which Adair pioneered. I just because we're in London Climate Action Week and there's been a lot in the press about the UK policy on climate, I just wanted to make a couple of remarks about the last 3 things we published, which will all kind of come to a head this week. So in May, we published, I think, really quite a breakthrough report called the Well Adapted UK Report. Our Climate Change Act requires us to tell government every 5 years how bad the problems are going to get in terms of adaptation, but it didn't tell us how to prescribe solutions. Well, we've changed that now, so it much more follows the mitigation approach. And that report basically said we've got a really big problem in extreme heat, which we're living this week, so we were proven right. In flooding, we had terrible floods in the West Country, where I come from, in the first quarter of this year, and in drought. I mean, and one of the tragedies of our failure to act on climate change fast enough is that those 3 things are all lived experience in the last 12 months in this country. The UK farmers lost £800 million of revenue because of the drought last summer. The other recent report we had last year, we published our advice for the 7th carbon budget. You know, in the UK, we have this system of legally binding 5-yearly emissions targets, and our advice was that should be set at 87% below 1990 levels for the period 2038 to 2042. And on Wednesday night in the Houses of Parliament, that was voted on and passed, like all the other carbon budgets, although for the first time there were opposition parties voting against it, although the leaders of the Conservative and the Reform Party didn't turn up. I think, interestingly, we've done a lot of work to try and do some of the debunking of some of the nonsense that started to be. You know, we have people saying that the transition to net zero will bankrupt the country, right? Which is patently not true. It's going to deliver massive economic benefit, hugely improve the balance of trade, and in particular give us fiscal stability. The Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK did an assessment of what would the impact be of one fossil fuel price spike per decade if we didn't make the transition to net zero, and they came up with a figure of 13% increased borrowing as a percentage of GDP. We have a GDP of about 3 trillion, so that's £400 billion that we would have to spend just for rent extraction and for zero build if we weren't on this trajectory. And in fact, our latest research, which we published the week of the Iran invasion, was that the total net cost of investment over benefit in the next 25 years will be less than the impact of one fossil fuel price spike. Of course, we also have some people saying unbelievable things if they expect to be taken seriously by business and investors. People saying that they would rip up private law contracts granted for long-term renewable energy provision. So we've got some really silly politics in the UK at the moment. I would urge all of you to be quite vociferous in pointing out where silly assertions are made with no facts behind them, and it's part of our job as the Climate Change Committee to provide those facts. And of course, the last thing I'll say is that we, on Wednesday, published our annual progress report, which is the way that the Climate Change Act requires us to hold the government of the day accountable on whether the policies being put in place are sufficient to reach our legally binding targets. And very much on cue, our number one message was that this government needs to take electrification much more seriously. There's been a very big focus on clean power and lots of good progress being made. You can argue about costs and about trajectory and about all the details, but actually that's been a project over many governments in terms of institutional reform, which is continuing. But there's not enough clarity on particularly electrifying domestic heat and industrial heat. And there's even a bit of a wobble on electric vehicles. And to Adair's point earlier about the importance of understanding exponentials and technology cost curves, that's probably what I spend most of my time obsessing about. We are very clear, I think we're all here very clear, that EVs are going past the point of price parity, sticker price parity, because of that inexorable innovation curve. But we actually still have a Department of Transport which thinks that price parity won't be reached for a couple more decades, which is kind of unbelievable because it's so predictable. And if you make those wrong assumptions, you set wrong policies and you miss opportunities. I also finally want to shout out to Aaron for mentioning Holcim's Science-Based Targets Initiative. That's something which I founded in 2014, and Gonzalo, my colleague, who was the COP25 high-level champion, and I put at the heart of the race to zero in COP26. And we have well over 10,000 companies who've made that commitment, and it's driving innovation, just as you illustrated. Back to the panel, the other thing which we launched in Glasgow with Mark Carney, of course, was GFANZ, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, which famously mobilised, air quotes, a coalition with $150 trillion of assets under management committed to net zero. And what we're going to talk about in this panel is how you turn that stock into a flow, because one is not the same as the other, and it's certainly not automatic. So we've got a great panel. We have Robbie Singh, who's the Group CFO of the Adani Group. We have Sean Kidney, the founder and CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, and Rhiannon Marie Thomas, CEO of the Green Finance Institute, and who between them know more about mobilising large amounts of capital than almost any. So I'm going to take my seat now, and I'm going to start with Rhiannon Marie to ask her to give us a little bit of the framing. So Rhiannon Marie, just help us get a size of the total scale of capital that needs to be mobilised in the transition to net zero, and then maybe narrow it down a little bit to the power system. And then I'm going to come to Sean to talk about bonds in particular, and then Robbie to talk the practical experience of Adani.
That sounds very... Hello? Yep. That sounds a very organised way of running this panel, Nigel. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I feel I'm in the survivors' party here. So big question. How much capital do we need, and how much capital is actually moving? One of the things you did when you were UN high-level champion was commission Lord Stern and Vera Songway to actually start putting a number on all of this. And the number that sticks in the mind is between 4 and 5 trillion a year out to 2030. The good news is, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, last year, $2.3 trillion of global capital flows invested in the clean energy infrastructure and technology space. That was up 8% year on year. It is twice as much as was invested in new oil and gas exploration. But as I just mentioned, it was half as much as the academics tell us we actually need to be deploying. But the interesting thing to break it down is which sectors are attracting those capital. And the top 3 are electrified transport, renewable energy, and power grids. What those 3 sectors have in common from a financier's perspective is they are all well-established, mature sectors with clear business cases, clear cash flows, clear revenue models. It shouldn't be a mystery that that is where capital wants to invest. So that sets us up with the challenge of how do we get more money into some of the emerging technologies, first-of-a-kind technologies, not just electrification, but alternative fuels, carbon dioxide removals, hydrogen. How do we get money into jurisdictions that are absolutely critical for the transition and yet are perceived to present higher risk. So we're talking about the emerging growth markets, particularly in the global south. And the third challenge is, of that 2.3 trillion, a significant portion is still public capital, or money from developing development finance institutions, etc. And we all know that we're going to need to mobilize the commercial markets, the institutional investors, the private capital, if we're going to get to these numbers. The good news is, despite some of the nonsense you might be hearing in the media, private capital is still fully committed to this thematic. It is fully committed providing the risk-adjusted returns meet their hurdle rates. That has never been in doubt. Unfortunately, maybe in some of the exuberance of a few years ago, some of us might have thought that those with their hands on the levers of capital were willing to do things that would look a little irrational in the short term, because we were winning the moral argument that we are facing such existential threat that perhaps we should lower our returns expectations and our yields in order to invest. I believe the pendulum will swing there one day, but unfortunately we're not there yet. So in the meantime, we work with the markets where they are, not where they should be. And the markets are not asking the governments to fund the transition, but they are asking for clear industrial strategy, clarity on clarity on direction through clear industrial strategy and policy, de-risking where it is required through a whole bunch of mechanisms, most of which we have precedents for already, and for actually crowding in the private capital, not crowding out. Do not compete with the private capital. We can get into a number of examples there. But without sounding too Pollyanna-ish, at this end of this long, hot week, I think there is a lot to be optimistic about when it comes to actually mobilizing the capital. Lots of conversations this week as we are finally, I think, moving to a more honest conversation about what it's going to take to move money rather than an ideological one.
Great, thanks, Remy. I'm going to come back to. I love you talked about emerging, and then you said growth markets. And one of the bees in my bonnet is, can we stop saying emerging and developing economies? It's a term of art which basically screams risk to investors. And in fact, often we're talking about the most dynamically growing economies, and talking about opportunities in growth economies is very different from opportunities in emerging markets, even if they're the same places on the map. But we could come back to some of your thinking about how we mobilise the domestic capital in support of that in a later question. Sean, you've been driving exponential uptake of or issuance of climate bonds since you launched Climate Bonds Initiative. What seems like a lifetime ago. Now, give us a sense of the growth that you've seen and what's driven that, and maybe with a bit of a geographical overlay.
Sure, but let's go back to growth markets. Just a quick question. How many people in this room think there's a chance the Indian government will ever default on its debt? How many people think there's a chance the US government will ever default on its debt? Right, fair number, okay, right. I think the US government is currently AA plus to AAA, and the Indian government is BBB plus. Hey, there's some things we could do that could make a big difference to your interest rate, to other people's interest rates in that area. I do have a call of S&P next week because I said this on Guildhall and they immediately phoned me up. We've got some problematic methodologies in how we assess risk and growth here. And this is a big discussion. Now, what we're looking at is how we can mobilise investors into this conversation. First, because the bigger investors, universal owners, more than $100 billion AUM, and the people we speak with, do their own internal risk rating, usually. And they need to adjust their methodologies too, but they're often using S&P and Moody's as a starting point. And hey, we've got work to do. Some investors are already there. Like Kess, for example, has got a very big exposure to India because they actually see it as lower risk than everyone else does. And they've lost some money in some parts, by the way. But there is a real question of breaking the risk growth current understanding. You're absolutely right. But what Nigel's talking about is the green and sustainable bond market. So the purpose of our work in this area has been to engage, energise and excite institutional investors, 150 trillion of them or so, who have a long-term mandate as well as short-term mandates. These are the ones who have to pay your pensions when you retire in 20, 30, 40 years. By fiduciary duty, they have to make sure they match assets and liabilities. And it's difficult in the context of climate modelling. Now, you can argue about whether value destruction is going to be 2% or 25% by 2050, and Adair's done a lot of work on that in the past. The current models of gentle linear change out to 2050 suggest a 3% value destruction by 2050, and as we've discovered this week, linear is not how it's going to work. What we have is, in fact, the volatility risk, huge volatility impact, and when we start grappling with the modelling of that, which is very hard because there's no real precedent, we actually find lots of moments of value destruction, etc. This is a risk for them. They don't know what to do about it. But if we can give an instrument that performs short-term and also address long-term, they think, whoa, what's not to like? And that's why we've had green and sustainable bonds, which have grown from $2 billion outstanding when I started to now just about to hit $8 trillion US outstanding as a market. So call it a proof of concept that investors will invest. Now, we've still got to get interest rates down. There are still macroeconomic issues, risk perceptions, and so on. There's also trust perceptions that this stuff really is future-proof. Well, with solar, we can make that argument. But in other areas, like cement, how do you tell, Arun? It's really difficult. Well, there's been some work done, Nigel's done some work, etc., etc. That's what ETC's been working on so long. We're now working on resilience criteria. And we've seen Tokyo's first resilience bond for flood protection and storm protection and so on, which proved the point. It sold at the same levels of subscription, 7 times oversubscription, 5 basis points lower interest rate they get for the normal bonds, AAA, in the London markets, by the way, as a proof of concept. We're going to get, they're actually in the market again this week of double the size bond. We're going to see a lot more proof of concept to show that investors will invest. Now, just to assuage where Marie's concerned, it's not sentiment, by the way. There's a way market dynamics work. Basically, a bonus feature, secondary market. We find that green bonds don't have volatility. They have reduced volatility and, weirdly enough, most excitingly enough, increased liquidity characteristics compared to US Treasuries. When the bond market froze in March of 2020, US Treasuries stopped getting bids for 2 weeks. Investors told me they were still getting bids for their green bonds. So if you're a portfolio manager, this is gold dust, and that drives it. It sort of doesn't matter. We could have done it with Marmite bonds perhaps, but we made it work with green bonds and sustainable bonds, and now it's a big market. We need, though, to be able to grow this to where it is. Our official publicised target is 30 trillion by 2030, well above the 8 trillion that's there now. What have we got to do? Well, we need to provide extra support for this. Investors are keen. Marie's right. I speak to institutional investors in all major markets. They all tell me their biggest problem is supply. They can't get enough bonds to meet their risk yield requirements, as Marie says. We need to provide some preferencing. We need to educate them about credit risk guarantees. We need to bring guarantees in. Since 1790 in the US, 15% of all debt in the country has had a public guarantee on top of it for various policy reasons. That's how the US built its economy. It didn't build it with just free market forces. Now, there's some weird stories in there we don't know to go into, but that you get the idea. Now, we need North guarantees for South. It's currently single-digit percentage growth. It's got to be a lot higher. We do need policy support, and this is the fun area we're getting into now. We've managed to mobilise investors around the world. They're keen. So when I was in Canada last week, we started talking with the Maple 8, the major funds, about working with the Canadian government on measures that the government could take that would be fiscally efficient for the government and, if we get it right, voter efficient, that will enable vast quantities of capital. This is the dream of investor public sector collaboration, but we've got to make it specific. What do those specifics look like? Well, in India, a conversation of Mahindra says, I'm conscious that Adani has vast green hydrogen plans, but how do we ensure that there's enough offtake agreement? Do we need to worry about that? Robbie's, I hope, going to tell me in a minute, not a problem. We've got the price coming down. But in the meantime, certainly in China and in Japan, we've got a price problem. Green steel is 40% more expensive than ordinary steel at wholesale. But for a car, it's only 1 or 2% more expensive by the time you add everything else. Tax credit for Mahindra, 2% tax credit, would that be enough to get Mahindra to let some long-term contracts to do green steel? Well, Mahindra tells me it would. They tell me it would. I think we've got a collaboration here between Mahindra, Adani and the government to get these plants going and fund them and make offtake agreements viable to a baseline. We can do this in concrete too. In Mumbai, if we had a plan let alone in London here, where we have not done this, crazy enough. If you have a zero carbon building, which includes the low carbon concrete iron that you're talking about, and green steel, you get an extra 4 stories. Very simple. Every developer in London and Mumbai will be doing this if you control the height in that kind of fashion. There are things we can do that investors want to see. So we're in the middle of mobilising now, at least this stage in Canada, Japan and Brazil to begin with. You have investor councils talking of governments about measures the governments can take. It's working. The last thing I'll mention is in Japan, where thanks to a meeting that the chair of Nippon Life, who's also the chair of the Green Transformation Agency that I'm an advisor to in Japan, who's also now the chair of the Business Association that Cartman had at the Prime Minister, she came out with policy a week later saying, you're right, energy security equals clean energy. Japan is now ramping up its clean energy ambitions, clean energy, because of that engagement from the investment community. There's going to be a lot more of that happening in the coming world, but we need the detail now of the fiscally efficient measures that we can sell in for different kinds of industries. And that's where I hope ETC is going to deliver a detailed agenda for me.
Thanks, Sean. You remind me of the London Stock Exchange earlier this week, where they're talking about their work they do looking at a kind of climate risk overlay onto sovereign ratings. And I don't know, I'd have to go and look at the report to see what they say about India, but I know they underweight the USA and they overweight the UK. In other words, their view is that the US economy, both from a transition and a physical risk point of view, is ill-prepared.
So pissed about this. Yeah. So we're talking to them about how we work with credit rating agencies.
And we might come back to some of your ideas around offtakes later, but I want to turn to Robbie now. Robbie, first of all, Sagar gave us some of the headline numbers, but just give us a sense of the scale of capital deployment that Adani's undertaking. And you shared, when we were talking earlier, how big that is in the context of the whole country. Just give us a sense of the scale, and then I want to get into tackling some of the myths around the cost of capital blocker in growth economies.
I'll start with the story of how I actually first time spoke to Sean. And so to those who don't know me, I'm free speech absolutist, so I'm sorry if anybody gets offended. But see, when we were starting out in 2016-17, it was very important, we thought it was important for us to have someone like Climate Bond Initiative score or rate our bonds. And they refused. And they had their reasons. I understand that. Sean's a good friend. So one thing became crystal clear to me at that point in time, that there is an aspect called that we are investing and we are committed to invest and we are doing X, Y, Z, versus taking foundational investment decisions which are independent of any of this. We have never considered since that day, I promised myself, that we at Adani will assume the following: that no commitment of anybody in this field has any value whatsoever to us. Zero value. Because when we laid out our plans in 2017, we said that we'll be roughly around 20-25 gigawatt by 2025. That would have put us on track to be the largest developer of renewable power anywhere on the planet. And we were denied access to that capital, which had said we are committed to invest in this field. So we had to engineer a way to invest. We are roughly at that. We are 20 gigawatt of solar and wind power operating and 5 under construction this year. And we have about 3.5 gigawatt hour of batteries operating. So we are basically where we said we will be. In addition to about another $10 billion investment we had to make at Adani Energy Solutions into HVDC lines to directly transport green power somewhere. So so when we look at this, for us, immediately the thing was that the scale at which we wanted to invest, the maximum, if I assumed that time that every Indian bank could give us their maximum credit limited exposure, and every investor in the emerging market fund invested the maximum of what their exposure limits were, we would be about a third of the size. So what we did at that point in time was, we said, this is nothing to do with sustainability, this is nothing to do with renewable, this is nothing to do with saving the world. We will make money. So we basically said, we will do this, and we will make return that exceeds the return of any other electron chain. And that's how we got the capital. We just went to everybody normal. We just raised, issued bonds, normal bonds. They are rated investment grade, the same rating as Government of India. And we just mobilized normal capital. And the good part of that was, you throw enough money, people dance. So we had enough of the returns were juicy enough. There were a lot of dancers. So that's how we had to. And on the scale of it is that we have roughly about $100 billion committed to the energy transition. We overall have about $200 billion of planning commitments, of which we are very clear that within the next 5 years, we'll deploy about 120 billion. We are not crystal clear on the path. We have 6 years very detailed pathway. So 120 billion, we will 100% deploy. We don't care about what happens in the world, wars, this, that, other. If something doesn't happen to India, we will deploy $120 billion unconditionally. Rest, we have to still work through investment planning requirements. And that of that $120 billion, the domestic market can support us for give or take about 60% of it. Our global partners would be another 40%. Although all of the risk capital, which is equity, that is just ours. So we'll deploy all of the risk capital. So in that, we will deploy close to about 35 to 40 billion of our own equity and about 60-70 billion of global debt capital. So to put that in the context, that is outside of China, that is the single largest concentrated development risk being undertaken by private sector in renewable space by a company.
I think earlier you were saying that's 25% of the private capital being mobilized in India is...
We as a portfolio, we do about just give or take about 27% of all of the private sector investment in this space in India.
So can I just ask you just to sort of, there's I think, I don't know if it's received wisdom or a myth in a lot of circles talking about the need to mobilize climate finance, that the emerging, or as we're now going to call them, growth markets, because they have a higher cost of capital, whether it's fair or not, it's a fact. It's very hard to mobilize large amounts. Now, just say a little bit about, you say your rating is pegged by the national rating. Because you're reaching concentration limits, you're having to go beyond domestic capital providers. So you're introducing FX risk. Just give us a sense of where in your total cost stack are you having to pay more, and roughly how much, and where are you saving money so that you're still coming in as a profitable project?
Sometimes what happens in finance is that if we focus too much on the headline rate, I mean, the key aspect is what is your risk-adjusted cost of capital, and at what duration.
Yeah.
So what you want to see is what is your risk-adjusted sustained cost of capital, and for us, when we model a generation. So what we do is we say, okay, if we take an investment decision, then over a 30-year period, what is the cost of capital we want to have at that risk? In that 30-year period, you now have to account for event risks, wars, so-and-so disruption. You account all of those, you do event risk modeling, and you go through that. Now, when you look at that aspect, the current headline rate is irrelevant. Because when you look at, which Adair and team were talking about this, when you look at a 30-year period, we are getting the benefit of the technology dividend. We are getting the benefit of the building blocks that are underlying compounding. So consequently, you are on an exponential curve that is not currently parabolic. It's still going. So you are saying, okay, now what happens is that in that scenario, if we can assure execution in a certain framework at each of those blocks over that 30-year period, we as equity can accept that higher risk position ourselves. Moment we accept that position, current rates over the 30-year period are perfectly fine because we are pricing a duration into our sustainability. And that's where that lot of the climate finance and sustainability folks, the aspect that the duration capital, okay, and to understand the sharing of this exponential value gain and the technology dividend, okay, if this sharing is understood appropriately, then the cost of capital that is currently available for on a risk basis for investment into energy transition is actually remarkably cheap. We can beat the ceiling of India simply because we can offer a lower risk structure of these parameters. So we have to go through those parametric aspects. That what happens if you get stranded asset risk? What happens if you have a technology shift? What happens if you go to triple lamination from current single lamination and so on and so forth? So you have to layer this out and say that this is part of our operating and development and investment structure. And these are such high, the value that Adair and team were saying, the value of the energy curve coming down in relation to the electron price from renewable sources, that value exceeds the cost of capital by a factor.
Right.
So if it is 8% to 10 basis point change, that is irrelevant number.
So once again, as we've talked about, having a really clear sense of where the technology is going becomes a really important part of assessing risk. I want to make sure we finish on time.
It's more than that, and I've got to pick up Robbie's point earlier. The arguments we had all those years ago, 10 years ago, was basically around investor perceptions of transition plans. Our board, made up of large investors, weren't happy with putting a stamp on the Adani debt because they felt that Adani at that time had a huge coal mine in Australia, which would have used up the rest of the world's carbon budget in one go. And they said, we need a transition plan where they're planning to leave their coal mine. In practice, that's what actually happened. But at the time, they were looking for, we're saying now, clearly, this is shaken out a bit now, because, of course, what we want to do is reward positive. Now, there is still a discussion in Europe going on about entity commitments versus use of proceeds commitments. And what Adani ended up doing is issuing, in fact, a whole pile of very successful green bonds as part of that. But it is a debate still going on, and I'm coming down quite strongly today and saying what counts is the positive stuff. I do think the coal mine at the time was a problem. I understood what investors said, but the practice was you were actually moving. You couldn't tell me the time to change. And this is one of the difficult things of assessing the transition plans of companies. How do we pick the right kind of investors? Because above all, we know we need. This is what ETC's been pioneered. We've got to support companies to go from brown to green. That's the game. That's the most important thing to do. That's what the economic challenge is to do. So our journey together on this issue exemplifies that changing perceptions. I feel like we've got there.
Yeah, no, I don't want to. Sean is a friend of mine, so I take the liberty whenever we catch up for breakfast, we catch up all that stuff. So it's nothing. I have nothing personal, but I wanted to highlight that there are ways. We have a pathway. The pathway is that all of this makes economic sense when you look at it over a generational period, and the consequence of generational equity loss, if we don't do this correctly, is too horrific to consider. So therefore, it is a generational economic value we know how to monetize this generational equity value into current investment planning. And we will continue to do that. So we are a little bit immune from this sort of the rate discussion. What's helpful now recently has been is that the overall understanding of the sheer scale of the transition execution that is in front of us. Like, while 4 trillion is a number, 4 trillion is not nearly enough in relation to what I think to move. Anything that moves in the world has to go electric. Okay, anything that moves, any machine that moves, any part that moves has to go electric. So when you look at that, then its number is much higher, and we are not at that level. So consequently, I think that we are willing to share. We share that openly. We make up papers public. They're on our website. So people can look at our finance planning, people look at our investment risk planning. And the idea is to share that in a wider way. And we have a lot more buy-in now. We have a huge level of pushback still in Europe, for I don't know for what reason, but so Europe contributes about 6 or 7% of our total capital, but US contributes this global percentage. Asia contributes percentage, but the only place we really struggle with, I don't know what the mental block is Europe.
Great. I mean, there's also this. I think we've seen. If I talked about GFANs, I think 5-6 years ago we were very much talking about. Still, there's a whole concept of trying to reduce financed emissions. Now there's a much more emphasis on transition planning, which I think is a much more sophisticated approach. Look, I know we're near the end of time, but I just want to pick up, Rianne-Marie, when you're talking about what's moving now, you said that most of what's moving is renewable energy, EVs, and grids. So I just want to see if there are any insights from the panel on how do we mobilize capital for the other bits of electrification, particularly some of the things that we talked about earlier where there are still quite high upfront costs, so that we need maybe a slightly more sophisticated approach to justifying the finance. And Sean, you mentioned a bit about offtake agreements, but any thoughts on things like in the UK, for example, financing the transition to domestic heat pumps is a real challenge. So any thoughts on the bits of the electrification finance journey that are a bit harder to reach at the moment?
So I've got lots of very granular examples that I could give about how you do this, but I think they could be a little dull. So instead, I'm going to take what I think is a key lesson from this panel, which is you're sitting here with the sources of finance from the green bond fixed income market and the uses of finance through a developer who had projects that they were willing to actually deploy that capital into. That is finance 101, right? Whenever you actually look to model any transaction, you have to look at your sources and your uses. And yet, strangely, that deal-doing discipline is often missing in a lot of the discourse that we have on this topic, which is why we have a landscape that is littered with public-private partnerships and funds that are set up and very well-intended supply of capital that hasn't identified the vehicle that is going to deploy it. So what are the lessons we take from that for electrification, first of a kind, any of these new technologies? It is if we were to actually adopt more of a deal-doing discipline, one point that you made, Sean, you would define your end objective very, very clearly. What is your specific sector, your specific geography, your specific outcome that you're trying to achieve in gigawatts? And then you work back and you go, what are all the aspects that I need? What does my value chain look like? Starting with government setting targets and setting commitments. Financiers can't actually finance targets and commitments. So you need to turn those things into the right regulations and policies. You then need to make sure that you've got the right institutions that can actually deploy government capital. You then need to structure that to bring in the private capital. And if you're successful, you end up creating a new asset class or a new way of investing that is so vanilla, that is so well accepted, that that's when the institutional capital can pile in and we get to the 30 trillion by 2030, alongside other investment vehicles as well. So it's that idea of transactions through to transitions that is actually a pretty new idea, because I think we've been so overwhelmed by the challenge. It is global, it's huge, it's existential, that there's been a temptation to think, well, we just need to green finance. What are the big levers we can pull? As opposed to thinking, how do we avail of finance? How do we finance green? And it is those transactions be them electrification or any of the other first of the kind, that we actually now need to pursue in earnest, not just through collaboration, but through genuine coordination behind very well articulated specific outcomes.
Yeah. Actually, I think we have an interesting example in the UK right now where Ofgem have just qualified the first 16 of the next wave of long duration energy storage projects. And of course, there's a price mechanism now, which is the main thing which is going to de-risk those projects which get the first contracts. Final thoughts, Sean and Robbie, on the hard to reach bits and how we unlock capital for
in
them.
2024, 95% of electricity generation investment on the planet was clean energy. Guys, we've won. Look at Adani. We've won. We're moving in that direction. Last year, it might be down to 90% because data centers. We launch it. We have just launched the Greening AI Data Centers Coalition. If you want to know about it, come and talk to me afterwards. All the global building standards companies, investors, and a whole lot of customers like AWS in that coalition. There's so much that's already been done. 2, in Pakistan, second thing, Pakistan, it's gone from 0 to 13% for solar in 5 years, I think it is, with cash. No debt, no nothing. Cash and YouTube, no networks, no experts, YouTube videos. Thank God for YouTube, who would have said it? This is what's happening around the world across Africa right now. It's not that complicated. But if you want a bit more complicated, look at Australia. We've had battery subsidies for the last couple of years. The government has ended up paying out 3.5 times more than they expected in battery subsidies. $1,000 a subsidy, not a lot, but it has been phenomenal. You heard Greg Jackson talk about it before. Gas is kind of going. The demand for peaker gas is disappearing in a fluff of battery usage. And of course, generators are making more money because they no longer have a negative rate in the middle of the day. It is going so fast. It is unbelievable. And I've got one virtual power plant company in Sydney who is so excited about the opportunity of using car batteries, as Greg was talking about. They're doing the economics on giving away electric cars to their customers in return for being able to use their batteries during the day but not using them power plant. Guys, this world is in the middle of a revolution.
I think that's a round of applause. Come on, I got that. Robbie, final thoughts, the hard to reach.
There are two clear pathways. One is we have a lot of dumb systems and they need to become smart. So for example, currently we are in the midst of rolling out one of the planet's largest smart meter program in the country, like that is Adani Energy Solutions, and making dumb machines smart. So you want to create a data backbone, and that becomes a access point to reach areas which you otherwise would find difficult to reach. It allows you to distribute, and it allows you to chop off peak. And so that will happen to making things smarter, and we are bringing the cost down of making things smarter. The second part of it is that we are also working on it in Silicon Valley. Obviously, a lot of the companies are also working on it. We hope to come to a point shortly, which is the second pathway to this, is that we will actually make the chip itself not require any operating system, etc. to operate. So consequently, we'll embed a part of AI onto the chip itself, so it's a processor. So when you do that, so to give you a tech speak, my apologies. So like normally, if you don't use the chip, you are using equivalent frequency of about 3,000 hertz. You embed the same thing on the chip and exactly get the same outcome from that one electron. And now it's about 20 hertz, so it's 150 times less in energy use. So consequently, so this will happen, and it's happening. So we're deploying what we call edge compute. So this is basically what that is. So you deploy the edge compute, and it allows you to reach areas where otherwise you would not reach. That is industrial installations, and that is industrial machinery, which is standalone sometimes, which is in remote areas sometimes, which might not have the grid support sometimes. So when you make this reach that part, it allows you to convert the nature of that system, and when you convert the nature of the system from fundamentally in terms of its operating architecture, a real life example. If we were to, which we are trying to implement, which is that the vertical hierarchy of organization shifts to a horizontal one, and impact of that is, say we need 5,000 acres of land to build a power plant. It compresses down to about 3,000. So land, because you now don't need, you only need 9-meter wide access for fire safety because people aren't moving in it. So there are many of these things that come from having a data spine and being able to reach that. And so there is a significant alteration at industrial level that's going on. It's difficult to see at the moment because it's not large enough. But what you will see is that as we deploy this in a larger scale, so we ourselves will go from 20,000 edge compute places to, which is basically edge data center, sitting on a chip, to say, in our case, we'll have about 50 million of them. Immediately it becomes obvious. So it's going to become obvious one day.
So I think I want to pick up on that phrase as we wrap up. I think you're talking about changing the nature of the system. If I think about domestic energy use in the UK, right, it's typified by 3 completely separate dumb systems. Electricity for lighting and sometimes cooking, gas for cooking and heating, and petrol. And in the future, the future that we're moving towards is 3 smart interconnected systems. In fact, one of the things that I've been talking about lately is that in the UK, the way we talk about energy bills is still anchored in the past. We have an archetypal household that Ofgem defines, which is electricity and gas. They forget the EV, they forget the car. And one thing that I'm saying is we need to have an archetype of a fossil fuel house, petrol, gas, and electricity, an archetype of a future electrical house with the full technology stack and all the smartness built in, and talk about the impact of policy on those 2 households. So, because we need to sell that future much harder. And I think between the 3 of you, you've given us a great story of just how much the finance is flowing to that future, but how much more we've still got to do to keep selling and demonstrating that future is inevitably smart and electrified. So with that, thank you to a great panel, and let's have a drink.
Thanks very much. Just hang on and we'll get a shot of you before you leave. Photographer will be in charge. Great. Lovely. Happy. Thanks very much indeed. Just a couple of very quick thoughts from me. I loved Robbie's description of this generational 30-year view when so often you hear about the domination of quarterly thinking and short-term political cycles. Sean's excitement at giving away an electric car so that the grid can use it for storage, I thought was amazing. My own version of that is I was in Mongolia last year. Every nomadic horse herder out on the steppe has 1 or 2 solar panels propped up against their yurt. If you want a sort of a definition of a transition that's just driven by common sense. And I think that's one of the answers to the sort of disinformation, the ugly politics in more and more of our countries, the sort of tsunami of nonsense and myths that is pumped out every day. I think that the cheaper and more accessible and more obvious these technologies become, the more it'll just be easier to argue for them, and people will just pick them up however they voted. And in parallel, and going back to my opening remarks, which others sort of followed as well, about the new reality of our new climate, which is more hostile, I think the lived experience of heat, wildfire, flood, might also provide an opening across the political aisle for people to understand that this is real. The wonderful American climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe says, a hurricane doesn't care how you voted when it rips your roof off. And I think that's applicable worldwide. So the twin realities, the greater, cheaper availability of the new technologies combined with maybe the penny dropping that this climate thing is real. So look, thank you very much indeed for this session. Part 2, by the way, comes next. We all deserve a drink. 3rd floor, the gallery. You're all very welcome to move on there for the second section of this day's events. Thank you very much indeed.